I, Tantus Narp and Dracovin, Lord and Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome. It is time to continue our discussion on Spelljammer. Of course, we've been talking about all these campaign settings from Dungeons & Dragons, originally built in AD&D, and I was talking about Spelljammer, one of my favorites to begin with, the D&D adventures in space. We were talking about some of the races in space, and I'm going to try to kind of finish up with the general races before moving on to the more bestiary or less likely for you to play races. Let's talk about a few more. Let's talk about a few more groups in space. Golems. Now, golems in space are very unique. They don't have to have any kind of air. They don't eat. They themselves may indeed have pockets of air around them because of their very nature of being kind of inorganic materials they're originally made out of. Greater golems that can be built by wizards are even sized possibly up towards ship size, that you can have huge golems protecting it. Wizards will have workshops or bases of operations which they might have golems protecting. They might even put them in orbit around them. So if the fact is someone comes in on some kind of ship, the golem in orbit would just then board that ship and take care of business as need be. Now, golems work just like they would down on any other kind of planet or anywhere else in the universe. The only difference is if they have some kind of breath weapon. Either they would keep that breath weapon within whatever sphere of air would be around them, or if they're using it out in basically the void, it's ineffective there. It doesn't travel anymore. You effectively need air for the breath weapon to travel. Let's move on and talk about lycanthropes, because there are lycanthropes in space, and in a decent number. Not a huge number, but a decent number. They work differently. If you are just a natural-born lycanthrope, you have no problems when coming into space. You are, in fact, not limited. You don't have to worry about things like moons and stuff, and you can change at will. The problems comes if you're an inflicted or an infected lycanthrope. If you were infected on some kind of planet, then its system, its planetary schedule is what you're going to be adhering to when it comes to your transformations. You would transform just like you would on that planet, and that would be what would be limiting you. So it would still be unusual, and you'd have to keep track of time according to what that planet would be. It becomes even worse if you are infected or, changed in space. You're no longer limited by the planetary system. You don't have to worry about that planet's moons. There's nothing that can prevent you from changing. You could change because of anger, because of violence, because of blood, because of seeing a full-bodied of planetary body, if you see the entire thing of it. The changes are so random and unpredictable, it makes it very dangerous for you and very hard for you to control yourself. It becomes a huge problem. That's why many lycanthropes keep to themselves. They come up with ships of their own where there are things like pirates or traders or just general explorers, that they're in and amongst their own groups. They form sort of miniature colonies aboard these ships or small colony areas throughout space that they're separated out. The exception would, of course, be were-rats who love being with people and oftentimes will find larger cities in space and then colonize those, coming up with groups of them there. Now let's move on and talk about, everything else in space, just to briefly mention all the other monsters in space, because you're not limited by what I've talked about here, technically speaking. I will talk about some specific space-based creatures in the next episode, but in this one, we're talking about everything else you'd find in a monster manual. You can find them in space. There's only a couple limiting factors in space, really. The first limiting factor is anything that's extraplanar, generally speaking, doesn't like traveling in between the crystal spheres. So if you're an extraplanar creature, you're going to want to stay to a specific sphere. If you are a creature that is in multiple planes at the same time, something similar to a ghost, undead are traditionally immune to the effects of having to travel out into space, but other things are more limited by that, and the fact is they dislike traveling into space or have limits on their ability to do that. And then you have to worry about things like air and sustenance that a creature may need. If you have a dragon in space, it's going to have a supply of air, water, and food that is going to have to keep it going. Think about it that way. So whatever you are in space, you're going to have some kind of environment that is sustaining you while you're out there. If you go beyond any of these factors, anything could be found in space. Things I don't mention could be found in space. There's the possibilities. It's just they are very minor. The reason that a lot of these are found out there is, according to rumors, it's because there's these creatures called the zookeepers, or keepers, that form a similar role to the arcane. They appear as these smaller, halfling-sized creatures that are known to travel to various worlds and effectively gather together natural creatures in order to study them, and then their efforts have helped spread creatures across the various spheres. Now, of course, these are only rumors, and no one has been able to confirm their existence as of yet. But the fact is that you can find very unusual things that seem like it would be more ground-based in space does kind of pertain that something is causing them to be able to travel out there with frequency. You can find even things like treants in space, as unusual as that sound for a creature that's an actual plant. Now let's talk about starbeasts, because starbeasts are a very important thing to mention. Starbeasts are effectively planet-sized creatures that exist out in space. They have been known to either just travel about on their own, or some of them have been known to carry actual planets on their back. So if you have, like, stories of a giant man carrying a planet on his back, this would be a starbeast that you would be hearing about. They are between 1 to 4 million miles tall. They are massive in size and far beyond the scope of anything that we could even think about. Communication with them is incredibly difficult, though it can happen, and they have been known to communicate back. So they are something you could theoretically speak with. The unfortunate thing is they are also nearly impossible to kill. They function much like a crystal sphere, like that. The fact that they themselves don't have any kind of gravity or atmosphere, and even having a planet on their back doesn't allow things like plants or anything to grow on them. So they have this sort of, they themselves are enigmas in it, and they're immune to effectively every spell or spell-like ability you could use, and even weapon attacks of any size that seemingly is reasonable. The damage heals instantaneously. Let alone if you're trying to fight it, it might not even notice you. Something a gargantuan or higher has a 1% chance, if it's engaging with it, to gather its attention. And really, Starbeast only has one ability. It has an at-will death spell effect that can effectively just try to kill you outright, that you would receive -4 to your saving throws against it. And it has a range of however big it is. So think about that. Now, there are, of course, legends of heroes or people that try to quest in order to slay Starbeast. But unfortunately, slaying one, if you could actually manage to, would usually mean the downfall of either planetary systems or the planet's very carrying. A battle with one of these, or even slaying with one of these, would have huge ramifications in the area that it's known to be inhabiting. It makes it kind of this weird catch-22. If you want to try to kill one, it might cause a lot of damage. You can find evidence of Starbeast on a planet, especially if you find, like, massive handprints that seem almost planet-sized, that would be unusual to be on a planet, or things like that. They do give a list of different types of Starbeasts that are known to exist in the book, so if you want to check those out, you can look at it. So should you communicate with a Starbeast, of course, it does have some information. It has very little information on any planets it interacts with or anything. It doesn't really care about those. Even if it's carrying a planet, it doesn't really know anything about it. If you do manage to communicate with it, it would know about other Starbeasts and how they travel within the spheres and their movement rates. So that would be how you'd be able to effectively find out information on other Starbeasts from a Starbeast. So that's it for today. I talked about Golems, I introduced you to Lycanthropes, I talked about pretty much any other monster that's in the monster manual space, and I introduced you to Starbeasts. Planet-sized creatures that are very unusual and effectively unkillable monstrosities that you really shouldn't try to mess with in the first place. In the next episode, I'm going to go into some races that are specifically in space and talk about them. Now, these, generally speaking, aren't ones that you are going to play as a player character. Not to say that it's not impossible, but you are usually not going to. But I'm introducing you to them anyway because they are, as I said, space-based. So if you have any questions, comments, anything you want to say, anything you think I left out, please leave in the comments below. Please like, share, and subscribe to support for the channel, the Empire, and the work I do. If you want to show some more support, you could always check out my Patreon, linked in the description below. But regardless, until the next time, I bid you farewell.